I'll get a do-over, which is a good thing. I'll probably, you all can rate if I do a better job with my introduction this time than the first pass. I feel like I'm doing a radio interview or something.
We are now good to go, Mark.
Terrific. And this is, good morning, everyone. This is Mark Pelka from the Office of Policy Management, Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Undersecretary. Wanted to thank everybody who's joining, whether you are a member of the Criminal Justice Policy Advisory Commission, whether you're a member of the public who is following the meeting virtually, whether you are a member of the media or anyone joining us today. I'm grateful that you're here, and I'm grateful for everyone's flexibility and adjustment and accommodation during a moment in our state, in our country, in our world that is presenting challenges and contingencies and requiring preparation and adjustment by the not just day or hour, but truly the minute. I'm giving right now some introduction and orientation, and shortly I will go through a list of the CJPAC members just to inquire who's on the line. As you can imagine, there are a number of issues and needs pulling people in different directions, so there will be some substitute members representing agencies or organizations, and there may be some people who will be joining us late because of a prior commitment. But I did want to begin with, just as we're sort of adjusting to a very different platform for our meeting, to just give some orientation and adjustment. There is a live event being hosted right now on people's web browsers. I provided a link to the CJPAC email list I have, and that email list consists of both members and interested parties. People who, in the latter, are people who we would see in the audience or attending CJPAC or perhaps watching on CTN. So those individuals will see a PowerPoint presentation that David will be hosting and clicking through. CJPAC members are using a conference call line, and so they are not able to see one another. It's audio only. I've distributed various materials that can be found on the OPM CJPAC website. That's where you will see the list of dates for our meetings and the materials that are posted for each of the meetings that occur. And on that webpage, you will see the agenda, you will see the monthly indicators report, you will see the presentation, and members of the commission have some additional materials that I share just to keep ourselves connected and in sync, despite the fact that we cannot see one another. We're in different offices or homes or locations around the state. And I'm thankful that we're all here doing our best to get connected, because it felt to me like a bit of a gaping hole last month when we were unable to come together as a commission and as a larger family because of social distancing, the closure of the legislative office building, and more. And I view my role as chairing this commission as bringing together points across the criminal justice system so that everyone can have a touchstone each month to review the latest data analysis, presentations, trends, receive input from stakeholders, touch on issues, identify opportunities for collaboration, move forward together with better awareness about issues occurring at points across our system, so that we can work together to achieve better outcomes for crime, for recidivism, for victimization, for public safety, for use of resources, and more. So today's meeting, it's unclear whether we'll take up the entire 2 hours. I asked people to budget that time in case our discussion leads us that way. The primary materials for looking at the agenda that we'll be going through today are first, welcome introductions, not just for me, from the good folks who serve on the commission, review of minutes from the February 28th meeting. Then we'll turn to the monthly indicators report, which is on the OPM CJPAC webpage, as well as was distributed to members. I won't spend as much time on the monthly indicators because we felt that the issues covered in that report were so striking that it warranted a more interactive and more detailed and a more consumable product. So we developed a presentation that I'll be going through. And And when I go through the presentation for folks who have printed copies in front of themselves, I will be listing, I'm on slide 1, slide 2, 3, and so on. And I hope that members would feel comfortable to ask any clarifying questions. I will certainly reserve time at the end of the presentation for discussion and reflection. But along the way, I might call on folks that I know I've interacted with about some of the issues covered in the slides and invite them to provide perspective. With respect to the presentation, I see myself as someone who can share data analysis carried out within our division and try to understand what those mean. But the folks on this commission know them better than anybody else because they've been living them for the period that's been covered. They've been leading agencies, organizations, they've worked with staff, they've worked personally to respond during the public health emergency. It has been an eye-opener for me to review these trends and to be able to connect the work that I hear is happening, and I've seen through announcements from different points in the system, and you see it playing out. And I think it's a powerful story of ways that criminal justice systems have adapted to the changing circumstances that are changing again by the minute or by the hour. I've been struck by the partnership and collaboration that exists. I think CJPAC puts it on display that folks in criminal justice tend to work really well together in Connecticut. They tend to roll up their sleeves. They tend to work alongside one another with general trust to lead to the better common good for outcome, to move cases through, to resolve things effectively. And I think you'll see that here. And I think you'll see strain. I think you'll see challenge. I think you'll see adaptation overriding that. And I'll certainly be covering that more when I get to the presentation. Following the presentation discussion, I'd like then to ask members to share updates from their agencies. I imagine they'll be informed quite a bit by the circumstances since the onset of the public health emergency. And I would invite folks to share what they feel they'd like to as an update about circumstances and issues and changes within their agencies or organizations. And I hope that as we tend to have during CJPAC meetings in person, albeit where there is eye contact available, there'll be a chance for one agency to react to what another says, to appreciate efforts undertaken, to identify further opportunities to work together. And I hope that the work will move forward after our meeting, after the meeting concludes, with further partnership, because I know that we are viewing the long term in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and thinking ahead to what comes next and how we better prepare for the next set of circumstances that will come our way. Finally, I just list generally planning, just so that we can circle back to how this meeting went, and to perhaps lay out ideas for next meeting, and then we'll move to adjourn. So I normally wouldn't have given such a long preface, but I felt that would be helpful for just getting people oriented to the materials, to the format, and to get started. So I think I will first move to just seeing who's on the line, and after that we'll address the minutes from February. Commissioner Cook, I hope you don't mind. First up, I just wanted to ask if you're on the line and you can say a quick hello.
Good morning. Yep, I'm on the line, ready to go.
Glad you're here, sir. How about Chairman Giles from the board?
Good morning.
Glad you're here, sir. Commissioner Ravella from DESP, are you on the line, sir? Okay. I understand that some members will be joining a little bit late, and we'll welcome them on when they start, and others can come on. Attorney Rapillo, you mentioned you're on the line earlier, along with your deputy, John Day.
Yes, Mark, I'm here.
I'm here.
Great. I know that our Chief State's Attorney, Rich Colangelo, who had his first meeting with us in February, had to miss this meeting because of conflict, but I think Attorney Rosado, the Deputy Chief, might be on the line.
Yes, I am, Mark.
Okay, terrific. And Dr. Norco from DEMIS, are you representing the agency today?
Yes, I'm here.
Terrific. Glad you're here, sir. I know Charlene Russell-Tucker from SDE had a conflict. Were you able to join, ma'am, or not yet? Perfect. I was just hearing that Humayun Beg is having some trouble connecting. I'm going to try to help him offline and so he can get connected. And I would ask my coworker, Eleanor Michael, if she could assist. Maybe that might make more sense because I'm not the best multitasker in the world. So Eleanor, if you don't mind, I think thank you, ma'am. I know Vinny Russo from DCF had a conflict, and he's going to try to connect in. But Vinny, are you with us?
I'm on, Mark. Good morning, everybody.
Glad you're here, sir. Thank you. And from Veterans Affairs, was Tammy Marsick able to join?
Hi, good morning. I'm not Tammy, I'm not Ms. Marzick, but my name is Jane Siegel from the DVA. Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Ms. Siegel, I'm glad you're here. Thank you. Thank you for dialing in. The next two on my list are Judge Carroll and Director Gary Roberge from Judicial, but I do know they have a conflict and they'll be dialing in about for the quarter of 10, so I won't ask them, but I did hear that Mike Hines might be joining from Pretrial Services. Mike, are you on the line?
I am here, Mark.
Glad you're here, sir. Thank you.
And Mark,
we're going to benefit.
Mark.
Yes, sir.
Mark, this is Judge Carroll. I'm on the line, and I think Gary may be on the line now, too.
I am, Judge.
Okay.
Great. Well, I'm glad the judicial branch is here. I know that many of the slides we'll be going through will reflect the efforts the branch is undertaking and responding. So having you triumvirate of Judge Carroll, Director Roberge, and Mike Hines here will be very helpful. So thank you.
Mark,
Chief Penny
this is
from
Mayan Beg. I was able to join as well.
Oh, relieved. Glad to hear it. Eleanor works fast, but I'm sure you'll probably already resolved your issue. I'm sorry I couldn't help earlier. Glad you're here, sir.
Thank you.
And Chief Kinney from the Vernon Police Department, are you on the line, sir? Okay. Office of Victim Assistance, Attorney Pierre, are you on the line with us? Okay. How about from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Karen Jarmock? Ms. Jarmock, are you here?
I'm here, thank you.
Glad you're here, ma'am. Thank you. And I will give a bit of an extra introduction to the next person on the list. I was, as I mentioned, I'm someone who can wear his emotions on his sleeve, and I was I'm facing a mixture of emotions at the last meeting of the CJPAC when in February, when I learned that the Alliance and Sexual Violence's Tracy Miller would be moving on to a new opportunity, and we were both wishing her well and recognizing we'd miss her presence given the tremendous presentation she'd given on the collaborative model with the judicial branch regarding supervision of people with sex offenses. That hole in my heart is instilled. I'm thrilled to announce that Beth Hamilton has a dedicated time for her schedule to join CJPAC. This is her first meeting since I've been serving in my role representing the Alliance. And Beth, no better time to have you on the line to share your experience and expertise serving victims and survivors of sexual violence. We're glad you're here, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mark.
And Dr. Cho from the Coalition on Homelessness, I asked you to join, sir, because of the work that you've done in collaboration with so many agencies on this call since March. In particular, I'm thinking about the work with helping to connect people who otherwise would be exiting on end of sentence to homelessness. You've worked with the Department of Housing, community providers, and a whole network of people who have done incredible work to help address issues of housing and homelessness during the pandemic. So thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join. I'm confident that during the presentation and updates, you'll have much more to share, more persuasively than me, but I think we're eager to hear your perspective, and I'm glad you're here in the line, I understand.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, we are too. And Attorney Healy, I'm not sure if you were able to join, sir. Okay, terrific. Well, great. Well, thanks everyone. I'm glad it looks like everyone's been able to connect. I would ask if you could please mute your phones during the meeting. That'd be helpful. I know I tend to be typing or drinking from a coffee mug, and I unintentionally make noise. So fortunately, I won't be able to mute myself for much of this. But I hope that if you do mute yourselves, please don't use that as a hindrance. If you're eager to jump in or raise a point, please quickly press that mute button and join in. I don't want anyone to feel silenced as a member of this committee, but I do know that we can have unintentional background noise along the way. So the next matter rather is the February 28 CJPAC meeting minutes. Thanks to my coworker Kendall for pulling these together. Does anyone have any concerns or questions about the minutes?
Yes, Mark, John Rosato, Division of Criminal Justice. I believe
John,
Rick Colangelo was present. I didn't see his name in the minutes, unless I missed it.
I believe you have found an error, and I'm so glad you're here, sir, and found that. I would, I'm pulling it up here so I can see it, and I think that I would move to make that change before it is posted. So you can be confident that Mr. Colangelo's name will be added, and I apologize for the regrets. That'll be reflected in the final minutes.
No problem.
Others have any questions or concerns? Cast for a motion to approve the minutes as amended with the addition of Mr. Colangelo's name.
So move, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And second?
Second, Judge Carroll.
Terrific. Thanks, Judge. We will amend the minutes and post them as final on the meeting. I want to turn next to the monthly indicators report, and then we'll go into the presentation. I want to thank members of the OPM, Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Division, for their work on the monthly indicators and the presentation, especially Kyle Baldwin from the research unit did an incredible job trying to pull together data wherever possible to respond to questions. Without his work, I would have been quite lost this last month and a half, or last 2 months. I'm speaking from the beginning of March 1, because the demand and interest and questions about data has seemed to never have been greater. And we wanted, given the rapidly changing circumstances, to be able to provide a framework to paint a picture for trends happening in the criminal justice system. So we relied on our existing sources of data and tried to broaden them a bit with the presentation. I don't think any presentation at this point on April 30th during this public health emergency can do complete justice to capture all the trends happening, but I hope this is a start. I hope this is a chance for us to go through a report and presentation and see what's there and note where what are the issues that we want to continue to track carefully in the weeks and months to come? What are the additional issues that we can incorporate into the analysis? And what are ways we can better incorporate the input of stakeholders into explaining the factors behind these trends? Looking at the monthly indicators report, you can see in the chart at the bottom of page 1 the difference between the 2020 forecast, which is presented in gray, and what is the actual population of the corrections population. And you can see that the projection, which was released in February, kept really relatively on track before March, and then there was that that period from March 1 to April 1, when the projection really failed to capture the immediate circumstances. I think the projection will, is as good as the variables and that are provided at the development of the projection. And every minute forward, it's subject to changes in policy practice and, in this case, external factors. So these reports will continue to show the original projection, I imagine, and you will see perhaps the trajectory that we were on, given the best available data, analysis, and forecasting, and look at what the changes were actually following the onset of the public health emergency. You will see to the left the number of highlights. These are presented in text. That they will be soon coming at you in charts. But this was a month of many superlatives. This was a month where we saw a drop in the number of arrests between February and March, which is a drop that had not been seen over that period in the last 10 years. In fact, over the last 10 years, arrests increased between February and March. So many months, many years by double digits. We saw a dramatic drop in the number of pretrial admissions to the Department of Correction. They dropped actually every week during the month of March, and the month of March is 30% below February. So we can see the main front-end driver of growth in the criminal justice system contracting. We saw the size of the correction population, which when I say correction population, I'm referring to pretrial and sentenced people under the custody of the DOC. The correction population shrank from March 1 to today considerably. The size of the population is at a level we have not seen since 1993. That's 27 years ago. The drop in rate, the percent drop in the month of March was the largest percent drop since 1988 in the size of the correction population. And that drop was relatively even for pretrial and sentenced. The trajectories were different, the movements were different, but that was fairly even. So obviously there are significant front end changes occurring. And that reflects the public's response to social distancing. It reflects law enforcement, bond commissioners, it reflects the courts and the prosecutors, public defenders, private attorneys, and others who work there. It reflects the DOC response too. And here's where I'd like to highlight that the trends that we see on the correction population is both front and back end. I mentioned some of the front end system changes. On the back end, I'm seeing in a number of areas, I'm eager to get into the details on this, a number of shifts in focus. With a drop on some of the front end drivers, human resources shifted toward preparing people for transition to the community. And a positive secondary beneficial effect you see in the releases from the Department of Correction. And this is reflected in chart 2A on page 2. I'm shifting here from bullets on page 1 to on the left side of the page to the chart on the bottom of page 2. This shows discretionary versus end of sentence releases. And I'll be highlighting this now because it's in the indicators report, but I'll be delving in much more deeply during the presentation to this topic. But you can see that the number of people exiting end of sentence dropped. It is the lowest number reflected over this period from January 2018 to March 2020. The drop in end of sentence, and end of sentence is very important, as many of you know. End of sentence involves people who exit the Department of Correction to the community without supervision because they served their entire court stipulated sentence in the DOC, and the DOC was legally required to release. So you can see in these trends, I would offer as a reviewer of data analysis, a shift from the reception and intake to preparation for transition. And with seeing the secondary reduction, secondary benefit of the drop in end of sentence, that means fewer people were exiting to the community without ongoing supervision and access to programs. What you see is an increase in the discretionary releases. They actually increased by 72% from February to March. What that increase in discretionary releases means is that through the various means that people can exit, or means, I mean mechanisms that people can exit the DOC, you see a jump in the discretionary parole, discretionary transition supervision, TS, and an increase in halfway house. So more people exited to one of the supervision, halfway house, or other means of ongoing supported supervision after exiting the DOC. On the end of sentence, that's going to come up, I think, when we get to some of the community level impacts on the system, vis-a-vis the people who are exiting EOS and don't have a home address or a sponsor. Again, they were required to be released under the completion of the court stipulated sentence, and a number of housing service providers worked incredibly hard to triage in concert with the DOC reentry director and others to find connections into the community. So I will pause for a moment and ask folks for any reactions to monthly indicators, while noting that we will be delving into many of these more deeply in the presentation. Before I wanted to make the transition to asking for questions on monthly indicators, however, I wanted to note that some data that's reflected more in the presentation concern the impacts on victims and survivors, and that's why I'm grateful that Ms. Jarmock and Ms. Hamilton are on the line, and because we tried to incorporate some data to look at the impact on victims and survivors, and also on victimization during this period. And there's some insights that we will glean as a commission regarding calls for service by the Hartford Police Department regarding situations categorized as domestic. And you can see some interesting movements regarding a reduction in calls for service regarding traffic and motor vehicle, some commercial property, which you might expect at a period of social distancing and sheltering at home. You see an increase in the category of domestic related. in the slide. And I wanted to share this a little bit out of order just because I wanted to be sure that we're acknowledging the impact on both victims and survivors, but also the advocates and service providers, because there's a level of adaptation they've had to make during this period. But I think it'll be an interesting discussion when we get to that piece regarding the calls for service to the Hartford PD. It's but one city, albeit a very important city, but because the data was available, we asked Chief Stody for a ability to include it, and he was willing to oblige. You'll also see some data involving victims that Ms. Jarmock provided regarding the lethality assessment program, or LAP. You might remember last year we were very lucky to receive a presentation on this. Lethality assessments reflect a partnership between victim service providers and law enforcement to assess dangerousness in situations in which law enforcement respond to a intimate partner violence possible situation. And there's some data, again, comparing March 2019 to March of last month, March 2020. So I do believe moving forward, I'd like to see how we can best incorporate more qualitative and quantitative input regarding victims and survivors and their advocates. But I did want to acknowledge that there won't be much content in monthly indicators, but there will be some discussion I believe we'll be having during the presentation. So in hindsight, I perhaps regretted sharing so much on the monthly indicators before the presentation, but I feel there's a lot of really rich and complex information I wanted to share at the upfront. And if it bears repeating, it might help for the kind of the percent changes and numerical changes to sink in. Let me pause for a moment, please, and just ask members of the commission any questions, concerns, or reactions to monthly indicators you wish to share now. Very good.
Mr. Chairman, this is Humayun.
Mr. Bagg.
Yes, I'll just mention that, the drop has been so steep that just the graphics itself fell off the axis, so we had to adjust the axis relatively recently. So I just want to highlight that.
No, Director Bagg, I'm glad you shared that. I feel that work, from a kind of visualization of criminal justice trends on charts, it was a scramble to figure out how best to capture it. And we thank you for the partnership that our division has with your agency. Folks will notice that on the OPM Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Division webpage, there's a link to charts that are synced up with data CJPAC manages that present trends in the system by the day. So that's a great point. Very good. Well, great. Well, I felt like through this whole process of developing the presentation I'm about to start on, it's been a partnership with Eleanor Michael, the assistant director of our division, and Kyle Bodwin, lead planning analyst, to pull this together. So I would definitely invite them to jump in with input. I think as you know, we've all had to adjust to situations where we're scattered, and I don't have the benefit of either of them in the same room where I am. So I would invite them, if there are questions that members ask that I don't completely or fully answer, or they have additional insights, their input would be very welcome. And Director Bagg was wise to introduce himself when he began speaking. That's something I meant to ask members, that although I may recognize your voices, others may not. So please just quickly mention your name so we know who you are. So I'm going to open the presentation, which I think many have in PDF format, and I'll move from slide 1 to slide 2. Lower right hand of the slide, you will see the number 2. And I'll try to say what slide I'm on as I move forward. Slide number 2 indicates that arrests dropped between February and March 2020 by 7%, in contrast to every other such period over the last 10 years when they increased. So if you look at the chart on the lower left, you see that in January and February of this year, the arrests were on track to follow the previous year. But the drop in 7% is even more, I think, striking or apparent when you compare it to the last year, when actually there was an increase. And indeed, on the right lower right-hand slide, you see that between February and March of every year from 2011 to 2019, there was an increase in arrests. And we're sharing this because of the seasonality of criminal justice trends, which the Commission has often reflected on, that occurred throughout the year. That when I'm comparing trends in March or April, I look either to February or January or even the prior year. And here, looking at the prior years, you see that in 2015, there was a 33% jump. In 2011, there was a 26% jump in arrests from February to March, which makes the drop that occurred during this historic month period from February to March in Connecticut, in our state, all the more impressive. We know that arrests are the main feeder into the criminal justice system. And so we try to follow somewhat chronologically, and you can turn to slide 3 next in the presentation. And here we present that pretrial admissions to the DOC shrank further each week in March. April's totals are on track to be even lower. You'll see the bar chart here shows 3 months, February, March, and April. April is missing 1 week because of just the timing of our meeting. But from February to March, there was a 30% drop in pretrial admissions to the DOC. And each successive week during the month of March, as you'll see on the bar chart, experienced a drop in pretrial admissions. And this says a lot, I think, about the impacts of the public kind of response to the kind of sheltering in place and social distancing, closures of businesses and various establishments, the shifting from external to internal, exterior to interior. I think it also reflects perhaps some issues in the bond commissioner's discretionary review, law enforcement's use of charges, same for how prosecutors pick up those charges, same for how public defenders and private counsel work with prosecutors on cases. I think also you see the impacts of the necessary changes in court operations, responding safely to the public health emergency. I believe the mitigation order from the judicial branch occurred, I think, roughly on March the 12th, the middle of the month. I often look at in the kind of the narrowing the narrow timeline here. March 1 is representing the beginning of the month. The middle of March is when you saw the governor's executive order, the governor's emergency orders being issued. I think that was March 10. March 12 was the court mitigation plan announcement, as well as the Commissioner Cook's announcement of the COVID-19 response. So there is sort of a threshold moment occurring mid-month that gives you a chance to see that analysis can be informative, not just over a year or a month, but in fact by the week as these trends occurred. So I thought that was an interesting way to see how March changed from week to week. You see the drop in DOC pretrial admits from March 8 to March 15. And April's admits are on track. As you can see, we only have 202 in the month of April, on track to be lower than March in that time period. We will be completing that remaining week of April after the data come in. We, on slide 4, look at the between March and April, the domestic-related calls for service to the Hartford Police Department increased 23%, comprising almost 1/4 of all calls. The chart at the top, yes.
This is Kyle. Back on slide 3, I thought it would be also maybe important to point out that even with the month of March only having half of the month being impacted by the COVID-19 response and crisis, that was the fewest pretrial admits that we've ever seen on record since we've been collecting that data from the DOC back in 2008. And April is going to be far, far lower than that, given the entire month we'll have the response in place. I just wanted to add that sort of historical perspective before we proceeded. That's all. Thank you.
I'm glad you did. That's very helpful. Very helpful. Any other reactions from members at this time before I return to slide 4? That's a great point, Kyle. Very good. So what's interesting with the Hartford Police Department, as with all police departments, categorizes calls for service that are submitted, and overall the number of calls for service from March 1st to April 5th. Let me state that again. The change in total calls for service from the weeks of March 1st to the week of April 5th dropped by 32% overall during that time period. However, domestic-related calls increased by 23%, leaving a 40% reduction in all other calls. So domestic-related calls fall on the bottom of the columns. And domestic does not mean domestic violence or intimate partner violence specifically. It involves responses to households. And it's a broad category that can include breaking and entering, disturbing the peace, simple assault, larceny, robbery, and more, but it reflects a response or a need emanating from a household, from a home. And so I mentioned that some of the other categories have experienced reductions regarding Hartford Police Department were motor vehicle and traffic. So I think what at this very early stage, with the data set that I have not previously spent a great deal of time on, I am struck by this reflecting activity occurring within the home, within the domestic unit, requiring responses from law enforcement, as opposed to responses taking place in an exterior fashion, such as traffic or motor vehicle or commercial establishments. To perhaps put a finer point on it, if you look at the chart below, it uses percentages composition as opposed to numbers. And you can see that the 23% in domestic related calls between the weeks of March 1 and April 5th actually led to domestics comprising 23% of all calls, which is an increase of 10 points from 13% on March 1. Chief Doty offered some additional weeks in the lower right-hand corner, showing that from the successive weeks in April, there were some fluctuations in domestic related. There was a increase in the week of April 5th to 11, followed by a drop, and then a back up again. So we'll need to monitor these over time, but I thought this gave some interesting insights in, regarding law enforcement business, law enforcement response types.
Mark, this is Karen Jarmock, and I just appreciate how you pointed out that while this is reflected of domestic calls, we just don't want it to be confused or viewed as domestic violence or intimate partner violence. These are calls for service, so these aren't arrests, and these are domestic related calls, so it could, IPV, intimate partner violence, is likely hosted in there, but it is not, it doesn't mean that this is a representation that there's been perhaps necessarily an uptick in intimate partner violence or family violence calls for service. What we're viewing in terms of some data that we've been receiving in collaboration with Connecticut police chiefs and also the Connecticut State Police is an actual 4% decrease across the state in calls for service around domestic violence. There are absolutely areas, though, in the state where there is an increase. Hartford might be one of those examples, but on the whole, when we look at the state, there has been a decrease of 4% in calls for service around family violence.
Terrific. Thank you, Karen. And I think something, you know, I'd be eager to work with you, collaborate with you for a future commission meeting is ways to, you know, to show, to reflect that trend, to delve into. It's great to hear you share the percent, and I think that's illuminating, and I think that more can be done to bring that information out. And I'm grateful for the partnership you have with CPCA. And I think that tees up the following slide, number 5, which uses data from your coalition, Karen, on the lethality assessment program results. And I'm really grateful you pulled this together so quickly. I really enjoyed working with Dan Cargill from your program. And at a risk of jumping into sharing analysis on data that I don't manage, I would defer to you, if you wouldn't mind, walking through elements of this slide, and I'd be happy to engage other members and offer a reaction myself at the end. But would it be okay if you shared some insights on slide number 5?
Hi, it's Karen
Karen,
again. I apologize.
No.
I was going to put myself back on mute and actually ended the call, so I'm sorry. I don't know if you had a
Oh my
question, but I'm going to put myself back on mute.
Wow, you dialed back in very quickly. I've been in that position before where I had to re-enter a password on a web conference and I was booted out and took a while to get back. Okay, Karen, I was just turning the focus to slide number 5, and I was thanking you and Dan Cargill for how quickly you pulled together data from March 2020 regarding the lethality assessment program. These are the screens of dangerousness conducted by law enforcement responding to calls for service and assessing situations regarding a person's level of danger of fatal violence and of serious harm. And so I was saying I'm interested in the data, but felt it would be appropriate to ask you to guide the commission through the content of slide 5. Would you mind walking through your insights on that? And I'd be happy to jump back in once you've completed that and move forward.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I just want to thank Dan Cargill, who's our Director of Law Enforcement Services at CCADB, who also oversees the lethality assessment program with CCADB across the state of Connecticut. And this is a real partnership with law enforcement where they voluntarily participate in this. So there's no mandate that they have to do this, but every single law enforcement agency, tribal police, many college campus police are participating. And so this is an evidence-based screen that's conducted with the victim at the scene of a family violence incident to understand their risk for harm and lethality or homicide. And so what's interesting when I was mentioning earlier around the decrease in calls for service, interestingly, what we're seeing is an increase in the number of times that these screens are being conducted. So you'll see on the top there were 809 in March of 2019, 876 in March of 20, which is an 8% increase in the number of lethality screens that are being conducted. So while we might be seeing fewer calls for service, we're seeing heightened circumstances where law enforcement is doing these screens and seeing an increase in danger. And so that leads me to the next point, whereas in March of 2019, 50% of victims rated at a risk of high danger, whereas that's increased by about 4% this year during this perhaps the COVID period. So we're seeing a 4% increase in lethality screens that are scoring high danger. We know that of the number of screens annually that are conducted, more than half of the time, individuals are scoring at a high risk for danger. And when they do that, law enforcement offers to put them on the phone with an advocate right there at the scene of the incident. And what we view is that more often than not, victims will select to enter services. So the final piece of the data that Dan has been collecting relates to officer calls to the LAP line. So there has been an uptick. And so that's really interesting because we do find that sometimes victims, for various reasons, don't want to get on the phone with an advocate right then. But we are seeing a difference right now where 19% more often victims are getting on the phone and talking with an advocate. And that's important. And when we're looking at all of the various systemic changes that are going on within the criminal justice system, this idea of enhanced safety planning is more critical than ever. So that's encouraging that at least we're seeing that there is an increase of times when victims are getting on the phone.
Very helpful, Karen. Thank you. And I think in times of significant in the media change and circumstances in our state, knowing that there is this partnership in place to assess cases for immediate danger, lethality, is a partnership that's more important than ever to ensure that situations are being assessed, that calls are being placed where needed, that responses are being applied as appropriate, and that resources are available. I wanted to ask, Beth Hamilton, I know if you wanted to weigh in a bit or hold till later, but I think I might be hearing you.
Yeah.
Or is that Karen?
Sure,
I'm sorry.
I can. Karen, sorry, did you have something else to say?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Sorry. So I would say that we're seeing relatively similar trends in terms of folks who are There's an overall decrease in calls for service similarly. I think we have some different impacts in terms of interventions with hospitals and law enforcement that we might normally have. So for example, our folks who would normally be going to the hospitals to have forensic evidence collected following a sexual assault are much less likely right now. So we're seeing some decrease in those numbers for folks following through with that. Not that the services are not available, but just there are some real challenges with having non-essential folks be going into hospitals right now. And we're also seeing in terms of our contacts with law enforcement that folks are overall saying that it has been, there are lower reports happening for sexual violence and sexual assaults, but also that it has impacted investigations. So it's much more challenging to conduct full investigations under the current circumstances. I think those are sort of the 2 points that I would make right now in terms of similar sort of law enforcement intervention.
Very helpful, Beth. Thank you for your insights. Okay, so on turning now to slide 6, wanted to share sort of more historic period in the history. This shows the trend of the correction population from 1993 to 2020. I felt it was important to look at the background that far preceded where we are today. From 1993 to 2008, there was an increase of 80% in the correction population. That's over 8,839 people. And then from 2008 of February to today, there was a drop of 44% of 8,832 people. So interesting, statistical note that you can see a roughly equal increase and decrease in the absolute number, but quite different percent changes, and that is resulting from the original number that produces that percent. But here we see that on April 29th of this year, the correction population fell to 11,062, a level last seen 27 years prior at the beginning of 1993. So heading into the period we're at right now, Connecticut has achieved a reduction in its rate of imprisonment and a rate of reported crime and a drop in arrests. So these trends have created impacts across the criminal justice system. But when it concerns the Department of Correction, the reduction in the population, the contraction of the population since 2008 has helped to create some space heading into this public health emergency, space that county jails and correction systems in states across our country may not have had heading into this period of response to the public health emergency. The following slide, number 7, shows that in March 2020, the correction population decreased by the largest monthly percent since 1988, and with current trends, April is on pace to eclipse March. This chart shows a daily percent change of the correction population from the beginning of the month, every month since 2000. You can see that the heavy, thick gray area around the zero, the center of the chart, show that there doesn't tend to be much fluctuation. Most of those months over that time period, it remains fairly stable, slight increase, slight decreases. The line, the blue line shows March. You can see just how different that is from most other months, every one since 1988. And then April, the line right below that, you can see that it's on track to eclipse the historic month of March over that time period. It gives you a chance to see the percent change and what that reflects from the population. As I mentioned at the beginning, the corrections population, this is on slide number 8, contains pretrial and sentence. Sentence makes up about 9,000, heading into this period, made up 9,000 people roughly, and pretrial made up 3,000 of a total 12,000 person population. So that's where we were on March 1, and you can see the line chart shows a 10% drop from March 1st to April 26th in the pretrial population, and an 11% drop in sentenced from March 1 to April 26th. That culminates in a net change of 1,347 people, reduction in the total correction population, with roughly equal percent changes in pretrial and sentenced. Interestingly, the sentenced population seems to begin its drop on March 17th. So that is in the few days following the court mitigation plan that was, as well as Commissioner Cook's COVID-19 response announcements. And so one of the areas in the court that was suspended, as I understand it, was the sentencing hearings. So what that created was a front-end reduction in people converting into the sentence population. And so you can see the begin of the drop occurring then. And Commissioner Cook has led a number of initiatives within his department in concert with other criminal justice agencies and stakeholders to manage its population, to prepare people for safe and effective reentry. And you see future slides will show you the trends on the release side of the system. The pretrial population drop, it certainly occurred at the outset, but was flat for a few weeks before dropping in a more sustained manner at the end of March, but really on April 1. I would offer that the pretrial population is in some ways more complicated than sentenced, in that it is an individual who has pending charges. It has a bond assigned to that person. It touches on multiple stakeholders, defenders, private counsel, prosecutors, courts, and so on. So what I have observed regarding the pretrial population is a true effort of collaboration involving CSSC, court, the large judicial branch, along with prosecutors and public defenders to review cases. There were logistical challenges presented regarding the closure of many of the courthouses, creating difficulty accessing paper records. There was adaptation here to provide electronic information. That was a true partnership I observed between our Chief State's Attorney, Rich Colangelo, or Chief Public Defender, Chris Rapillo, with the judicial branch in reviewing cases that were pending trial and communicating to the attorneys in the courthouses to review the cases. And you can see through the trend the result of that work and working to review, revisit, and process these cases to determine appropriateness for reduction of bond, for disposition. And the judicial branch responded to hold dockets and hearings to work through these cases. So amidst the response created by the public health emergency, there were efforts taking place that have led to impacts on both the pretrial and sentence population, leaving our state at a place where the percent drop is 11%, the net change of about 1,300 people. Would anyone care to weigh in at this point? I know we have a couple, one more pretrial slide coming up. Do you want to give people a chance to weigh in here if they'd like, or I will move on.
Oh, Mark, this is Gary Roberge. Can I just have a minute?
Yes, sir. Glad you did. Thank you. Please feel free.
So I appreciate the description that you just gave about the work that was going on, and I also just want to acknowledge that it was truly a collaborative effort. You know, Judge Carroll told us from the start, us meaning the branch and those working in our court services division and court operations, right, to work with Judge Alexander and the Chief Judge of Criminal Matters and Attorney Rapillo and Attorney Colangelo in their shops, as you pointed out. And I have to say Commissioner Cook and his folks at Department of Correction did a great job too, because we were able to set up remote hearings to try to move people out. You know, on the next slide that you have with the drops in the population, I was going to give this in my update when we get to the branch. But, you know, we approached it in a way where we took a look at technical violations of probation first, right? Those held on technical violations. Then we went to, you know, low bonds up to 11,000. Then we went to 11,000 up to 35. And then we took a look at all the kids at Manson Youth to see if we could move those kids out pre-trial. And then lastly, 35,000 to 65. And you can see in your chart that a lot of people were moved with the lower bonds, and it was through that process and through those efforts that we were able to do. And I always just want to point out when we talk about this that Connecticut, when you look around the country, Connecticut, and we know this, has a very low percentage of overall arrests to begin with that are held pre-trial in our state. So, you know, the fact that we're moving out this number of people through this process has to be considered with that in mind as well, that we hold very few people pre-trial while their cases are pending, right? And, and like I said, we couldn't have done it without the collaboration of the Chief Public Defender's Office, the Division of Criminal Justice, and the Department of Correction. And we continue to work on other areas where we may be able to make additional reductions as well. So I just want to acknowledge the staff in the other agencies and those in the branch, and particularly our pretrial bail staff, that continue to do this work and to try to keep as many people, out as safely as we can, because that's been our charge since the beginning. So thank you for giving me 2 minutes.
No, I'm glad that you did, and I'm glad you turned us to slide 9, and you did the work for me, sir. And I'm glad that you did, because you can explain it better than I. That the pretrial population dropped for all bond groups from March 1st to Wednesday of this week, to Tuesday of this week, by 8%. And the reduction was greater by multiple fold for bonds of less than 20,000. They were larger for bonds of 20 to 50K, and even for and then you saw smaller reductions before the higher bond amounts. And it was a methodical effort undertaken by judicial branch in concert with public defenders and prosecutors to go through these cases to determine safe, appropriate, and suitable responses for these cases. I wanted to ask if Attorney Rapillo or Attorney Rosado, if you wish to weigh in at this point. I think that this slide and the prior one kind of zoom in on the pretrial population, which you've been closely involved in, and then I'll be turning to the sentence population next. But I want to give you the floor if you wish.
Sure, Mark. This is Chris. I think Gary summarized it pretty well. We were able to get lists. I mean, it's been a few weeks of DOC and CSSD, in spite of everything else they have to do, producing lists that the prosecutors and our folks were able to go through, were able to agree on release or agree on some sort of a disposition that resulted in release for a pretty substantial number of people. Have to commend the leadership of the new Chief State's Attorney for jumping in and really working to try to get people, help get people out of jail in sort of a planful and individualized way. I think we had a lot of success. And lots of credit to Judge Alexander and to the judges too. And in instances where there wasn't an agreement, in a lot of cases, people were still able to have an argument in front of a judge, whether that was by email, whether that was by video conference. There was just a lot of flexibility displayed by everybody to try to move things along. I think the fact that the pretrial population, we were able to cut it, at the same time where we're not really disposing of too many things, was very significant. And we're sort of starting, at Rich's suggestion, we're now starting to have staff, both the ones that are volunteering in court and folks that have been working from home, are now starting to review files with an eye towards dispositions. Are there now cases that we can start to move on either now or to be planful and ready when we reopen? So I think Gary's right. There's been a lot of cooperation. We've been able to get a lot of people home to their families, and we continue to work on it.
And I would just like, it's John Rosado, Division of Criminal Justice. I would just like to echo both comments made by Gary and Chris. It has been, I think, extraordinary the last couple of months, the level of cooperation, both with the Public Defender's Office and with the private bar as well. And we couldn't have done all of that work with those groups without the help of CSSD and DOC to help us identify those folks that were in on the lower level bail and to be able to make those decisions and to move quickly. So I think there's a lot to be proud of in the state of Connecticut criminal justice system.
Thank you, sir. And I think I would cover the Mark jumping back in to say that I think Gary had made a very good point about the percent of arrests that lead to admission to DOC pretrial. The analysis that Kyle has run in our division suggests that 4 out of 5 arrests are diverted before there is an admission to the DOC, meaning that only 1 in 5 arrests involve a person who's ultimately admitted to DOC pretrial. And so there already are efforts and points that have been applied to identify suitable and appropriate populations for community options and diversion from the justice system, again, where appropriate. I'd also add that at our January CJPAC meeting, we noted that the DOC pretrial population dropped from January 2019 to January 2020 by 14%. That is a reflection of a lot of work in judicial, DOC, public defender, prosecutor, and more to, again, assess people for suitable options and divert or use incarceration where necessary for that population. So those were, I think it's important to have that background and those trends heading into the month of March.
And Mark, John Rosato again, I just would add one further point, and doing all of that while keeping a very mindful eye on our victims and public safety as well.
Right, that's right. That's the work that happens when a case is reviewed by criminal justice professionals. Is there's consideration for assessed risk, for criminal history, for victims, and on the topic that I'll be turning to regarding what community resources, services, home plan exists for people who are connected. I know we have, we're thinking about the role that DEMIS has played in connecting people to services in the community for substance use, mental health, and co-occurring, ways that partnerships have been broached between behavioral health and law enforcement, prosecutor, and other criminal justice points. And I'm thinking about what goes into the assessments that are applied. Part of what determines the bond amount is a result of a pretrial risk assessment conducted by professionals in the criminal justice system. And those risk assessments surface the issues that are correlated with risk of flight, and they also reflect circumstances in the community that are needed to support people who are not incarcerated. Those are the complex issues that are hard to compress, but really are fleshed out through conversations like this. Away on slide 10, turning to that piece, that we often, those in research who study correction systems look at the correction population as the level of water in a bathtub. The admissions are the faucet that come in, the releases are the drain. And so both admissions and releases play a part in the size of the correction population. And kind of hearkening back to slide 7, where I shared that during the course of a month, there doesn't tend to be dramatic fluctuation. You can see that through admissions and releases, there tends to be some parity between the number of admissions in, number of releases out from the system. It's part of the case flow, the cycle, the work that's done in correction system affected by external factors. If you zoom in or put your eye a little close to the month of January, actually the month of March, I guess our chart doesn't say April, but if that bar all the way to the right, it is March. The axis at the bottom says January, but it is the month of March. You home in on it, you can see the black line of the correction population dips. You can see that the admissions bar is lower, and you can see that the releases bar is lower. So it's a combination of the admissions and releases that led to it. But what this chart doesn't allow you is the ability to home in on or zoom in on type of release. And that's on slide 11, where we note that between February and March of 2020, discretionary releases of people sentenced to the DOC climbed 72%, while end of sentence releases fell 17%. And I'll be going through a slide and perhaps the next slide or two, but would like to bring in Commissioner Cook, Chairman Giles if they wish, and also Dr. Cho on the housing front, and anyone else who wanted to weigh in. But I'll share the data first and foremost that there's a 29% increase in releases from the DOC sentence population from February to March, and the number of discretionary releases increased by 72%. Discretionary release, and then I'll note there's a 17% increase in end of sentence. The blue sections of the columns are discretionary releases, and the red are end of sentence. So in most months, it's roughly 50-50 between these two, between discretionary release mechanisms and end of sentence mechanisms. And that is a fixture of our state in that we operate a unified system. There are no county jails. The jails are administered by the state. So we have data far exceeding most states where there is a split between sentences of less than a year versus more than a year, between county and state. So we're looking at everyone's sentence, which is it's much more illuminating, I feel. So the primary takeaway is the increase in discretionary releases from the sentenced population and over that 2-month time period. And I think I mentioned earlier with the area chart showing the drop in the correction population, one of the things I point to that helped lead to the trends we saw over the last 10 years was the arrival of the community release or CREW unit in the DOC to provide individualized, data-driven, risk-based assessment of people eligible for any of the discretionary release mechanisms, which are, I think, 5 or more. But 3 of the primary ones are parole, transitional supervision, and halfway house. That DOC had a built-in, streamlined, unified manner of reviewing eligible cases to provide information to decision makers for people eligible for any of the discretionary release mechanisms. So the fact that CREW existed, that level of data analysis and risk assessment could be conducted on the all eligible population for discretionary release within that sentenced subgroup. So I think that this was, in a moment of crisis, you lean on the resources and expertise and the mechanisms you already have in place, and DOC was immediately able to turn to the CREW unit to review all eligible cases. As I understand it, along with the criteria that are already applied, one was added regarding medical condition and medical factors. But one key piece to the discretionary release is the need that everyone exiting under that mechanism have a home plan or a sponsor or a place to go. And here's where there's an intersection with our housing assistance and homeless system, that in the month of March, the homeless shelters capacity was almost halved to be consistent with public health guidance regarding mitigation of risk of spread. So the shelter capacity was diminished, and that put an even greater emphasis on identifying suitable home plans and sponsors for people exiting the DOC. So in order to accommodate that increase, there was an intensive effort that occurred from what I observed from intake and admission, which as you saw dropped in the DOC, to preparation for reentry and transition, which you can see reflected in the chart here on slide 11, that I heard the DOC called family members and other support members for people who were eligible for TS and asked them to reconsider. There was an increase in families willing to accept people back into their homes. There was effort done within parole and community services to look at the halfway houses to be more efficient and streamlined, to move people through, to open up beds, to give people a place to go. And then there was effort to identify cases as early as possible of eligibility for TS and work with those cases. And finally, there was effort, a collaboration conducted between DOC and Board of Pardons to review cases eligible for parole to, again, be more efficient, streamlined, and proactive with those cases. So it's one chart that I put forward, but there's a ton of work behind it and human lives behind that as well. For people that were, whose cases were reviewed thoughtfully and carefully to find suitable options. And all discretionary releases that were conducted were done consistent with typical DOC release practices, which means complying with victim notification and providing victim input into the decision. Using whether there was a victim attached to the case as part of the decision-making process through that assessment. And as a result of seeing the increase in discretionary releases, you see a drop in end-of-sentence releases, which is an especially positive thing during a moment where there are a halving of homeless shelters, where there is limited housing options, where businesses are not open, where job needs perhaps are greater. So the lower right-hand corner is our effort to show you the percent distribution between end-of-sentence and discretionary releases, and the end-of-sentence cohort dropped to 31% of all sentence releases, which is the lowest percent over the prior 12-month period. And the percent of discretionary releases is higher than any other month in the 12-month period that's reflected here. I wanted to be sure that I'm emphasizing that homeless shelters are not a release mechanism. They never have been. DOC does not release to shelter. It is something that this commission has studied, that there is a overlap between populations exiting DOC at some point in a 3-year period, and intake to a homeless shelter in a 3-year over a 3-year period. And that involves people who are either admitted to shelter before or after. It just shows that there is a overlap, and that is understandable because there is a higher rate of residential transients for people in the criminal justice system. So there is a indirect connection between the housing assistance services in the community and this population regarding its needs. So I think this slide says a lot regarding the eligible population for discretionary release and the trend that happened from February to March. And DOC deserves extraordinary credit for its efforts in the ways that it shifted its operations to maintain essential operations during this public health emergency. Because as you folks know who work in criminal justice, this is about daily triage of cases. If you're talking about prosecutors in state attorney's offices reviewing cases coming in, or DOC looking at cases eligible for transition out, there are triaging and prioritization of cases that are happening. So I wondered, Commissioner Cook and Chairman Giles, want to give you gentlemen a chance to weigh in, and then Dr. Cho, you as well, perhaps after, and then anyone else that might want to jump in. I just thought this slide shared quite a bit, and I wanted to spend a bit more time on it.
Hey, Marcus, Commissioner Cook. I'll jump in. I'll because of time, I'll save most of my comments for the update. But I'll tell you, your description of the crew unit's right on. I mean, they've absolutely crushed this. And when Gary and Christine were talking about that collaboration, it was those folks that did a lot of that work on our behalf as part of that team. The other part that I think Connecticut's should be proud of now and should be very proud of in the future is how we've handled the home plan, making sure that these folks have sponsors and homes or halfway houses, people that they can go to. Again, big credit goes to Dr. Cho and the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, and Trina Sexton and different people from our shop. And again, this has been about a balance of public safety and public health, and it's worked because everyone around this table and on this phone call today worked together. So I'll say the rest of my comments for our update.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Chairman Giles, and I just echoed what you said and actually what Commissioner said about the collaboration. A lot of us, work behind the scenes to make this thing go as smooth as it possibly could. So everybody has done, what we could. We've done our part. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And Mr. Chairman, I just want to echo everything that you said and also that Commissioner Cook and Chairman Giles said as well. This is a huge effort. I mean, I want to emphasize the point you made about the relationship between how many people can be released discretionarily versus hitting their end of sentence, and the indirect relationship that has with housing availability. And I think what this slide really reflects is the extraordinary efforts that the Department of Corrections and the Board of Pardons and Parole have taken to try to identify housing. And it's something that we've learned in the homeless system, is that many of the people who seek homeless services, who say, I have no place to go, well, it turns out if you actually put in some additional efforts and staffing and work to try to identify safe alternatives for people, that we've been able to do that. And that's a big part of our efforts through shelter diversion across our state, are really about how to do that kind of practical problem solving and conversation to help reunify people with family members or identify safe alternatives. And I have to say this slide reflects really extraordinary efforts on the part of DOC staff, the crew unit, and also Trina Sexton and her team to try to help identify those other alternatives. And I think that reflects the fact that it is possible if you really ramp up efforts to try to identify those safe alternatives. I'll say I'm really proud that we were able to partner with DOC and with OPM on this housing initiative for people who are hitting end of sentence. And it's great that there's efforts that are already happening to identify people's safe alternatives to housing. And then we are also able to provide some additional assistance through the funding that was identified by OPM and DOC to assist people who are hitting their end of sentence to get stable and safe housing. And I really think we've learned some really amazing lessons over the last couple of weeks about what's possible if you do ramp up those efforts to identify safe housing alternatives, but also how a little bit of flexible funding coupled with the know-how of community-based organizations can also supplement those efforts to help people who don't have any other alternatives.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your contributions, and thank you for your work during this period. I think that you raised a very compelling point about how to reflect on emergency or crisis situation, is that having to respond speeds up, accelerates, deepens, broadens all at one time. I've spoken to many of you on this call and just hung up regretting any minute I took out of your day, because I know that your work is saving lives and is impacting lives and is making an enormous difference in our state. I bring that humility because I recognize that these experiences that everyone in our state is going through is creating lessons for the future. This is going, with respect to criminal justice, this emergency response, I think, will identify a number of lessons learned through collaboration, adaptation, modification of practices that will serve our residents well into the future after we turn the corner from this period in our state, nation, and world. And I think that the partnership that we're homing in on at this moment between housing providers, DOC reentry, and more is a good example. I think the example that Ms. Jarmock and Ms. Hamilton shared earlier about partnerships between victim service providers and law enforcement is another example that the backdrop and prior efforts that have been established and incorporated into our systems made our state, with respect to criminal justice, better able to respond to this moment of crisis. I have just one slide left, and I will cover that, and then we will pivot to updates. And I had aimed to allow a little more time than I did for the updates, but I think we still have a healthy amount to go through. If we have to shorten discussion of next steps, that's fine. I think I will be able to seek some input and put together a plan for future meetings, but I'm really eager to allow you folks to talk because I've done so much of it today. The final slide, number 12, shows the increase in discretionary releases between March 2019 and 2020 were larger for Black and Hispanic people than for the total population. The drawing from the last chart, between March 2019 and March 2020, there was a 27% increase in people transitioning from the DOC sentence population to discretionary release. The percent change was larger for Black people and Hispanic people within the DOC sentence population. For Black people, it was an increase of 52%. For Hispanic people, increase of 40%. And for white people, a 5% increase. The issue of disparity, issue of demographic, certainly warrants more than one slide, but I felt that it would be important to include this presentation, these trends, because there's been interest in them already. I think they provide some insight. This indeed is an apples to apples comparison within the different demographic groups. The overall demographic composition of the DOC population has not changed dramatically from March 19 to March 20. So we're comparing number released within these demographic groups from March of last year to March of this year. I'm looking forward to, as the efforts continue, that deeper analysis is conducted, but I think this is a helpful insight on this particular aspect of the presentation. We've reached the end of the presentation. The presentation is posted on the CJPAC webpage under OPM Criminal Justice Policy and Planning as the monthly indicators report. And I again want to thank Eleanor and Kyle within our division for their incredible work in getting this together. I want to thank the agencies that contributed data, thank the community partners and organizations that enriched this presentation. We just were struck by the historic nature of this period and felt that we needed to enhance the monthly indicators report with some more of these slides. And along with my reference earlier to looking ahead to future planning, I did want to say that we are looking for how we can best be helpful. So I think we will be looking ahead to future meetings on ways we can be a resource to our state with respect to COVID-19 response. Several folks had alluded to their, holding of some comments and input for the update. So without further ado, let's make that transition. And I will use the list that I that I had at the beginning of our call to go through folks on the line. And I'll start with you, Commissioner Cook. You were brave enough to go first at the beginning, and I'm asking you to do the same again now. But we'd love to hear your updates for the commission.
Good morning. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. So first of all, Kyle and Mark, thanks for all your work compiling and presenting that data. We all greatly appreciate your efforts for sure. I'll start with just by quickly recapping a few of the early actions that we took as part of the DOC COVID response in our facilities and in the community. Some of it you may know, but I think it's important for it to be out there for others who don't. So we suspended social visits and then enhanced communication by negotiating 2 free phone calls for our folks that are incarcerated. Suspended volunteer and vendor access. We modified movement, created a 3-phase operational plan that could be applied at any location. And what this does is it allows us the flexibility regarding long-term lockdown, allows us to still continue to have some of those things available to the incarcerated folks during this challenging time. So we've initiated an intake screening for all offenders, including a 14-day separation at the jails to monitor anyone coming from the street for COVID signs and symptoms before allowing access to the general population. We initiated and have maintained a continuous cleaning schedule at each facility and ramped up additional access to cleaning supplies and soap throughout. We initiated a screening and temperature check for all employees at the 14 correctional facilities and at each of the 5 parole districts. We've limited inter-facility transfers to essential only. We centralized the positive COVID-19 offenders at one location, the Northern Correctional Institute, which contributes to the preservation of statewide PPE inventory and consolidates nursing care and enhances our levels of care. Distribution of masks to all the facility locations, cloth masks being produced internally by offender industry workers, surgical masks, KN95 mask, and N95 mask with a policy associated with the use of each of those. We created a website specific to COVID-19 with daily postings of data points, pandemic plans, press releases, and memos for staff, offenders, and family members, and establishment of weekly conference calls with union leadership and elected officials. Most recently, our activities include centralization of a community release COVID positive patients to one location in the community. So these are the offenders that we have in halfway houses that are now, those that are positive are in one location at the Cochegan House, which is on the grounds of the Corrigan-Rogowski Correctional Center. In line with Governor Lamont's executive order, we've mandated that all employees and offenders wear masks when social distancing cannot be achieved. We've introduced the use of newly acquired cleaning technology called a power breezer to disinfect larger areas with the facilities. We're targeting locations identified in our organization as hotspots for the virus. And we've also acquired some backpack versions of these types of systems that will allow us to use them more effectively by our staff in smaller areas. Some additional efforts worthy of speaking to include a strong focus on releasing eligible and suitable offenders as part of the early preparedness plan. This is to piggyback off of what Mark and Kyle's presentation on population trends. In line with public safety, release decisions during our COVID-19 response plan continue to include a risk assessment and consider victim impact. Discretionary releases will require that the offender have a solid home plan, as we talked about. Homelessness and disruptions in community support services are a real concern for the agency. At the discretion, at my direction, release reviews are prioritizing offenders considered high risk if exposed to COVID. So these offenders are over the age of 50 and those with high medical scores. My team's monitoring the population count on a daily basis. The population count's dropped more than 1,300 since March 1st. This is the size of one of our state's largest correctional facilities. During our COVID response, the overall count fell below 12,000 for the first time since 1993. That's 27 years ago. Today's count is 11,024. By tomorrow, we'll be well below 11,000. There was a 72% decrease I'm sorry, I skipped a bullet there. The discretionary releases in March at the onset of COVID are the highest number of releases in 1 month at 522. There was a 72% increase when compared to the month prior in February. We plan to publish our April release statistics on Monday, which we anticipate to be yet another record-breaking release month. Current data related to COVID-19 positive cases for offenders and employees are as follows. As of 4/29/2020, 326 employees have tested positive and 148 of them have fully recovered and returned to work. 417 offenders have tested positive and 242 of them have fully recovered and been released from the medical unit at Northern and returned to their original facilities. As I wrap up my thoughts, I just want to make sure that we express our appreciation to all our criminal justice and human services partners, the Board of Pardons and Parole, Judicial, Public Defenders, Chief State's Attorney, Department of Emergency Service, Public Protection, DEMAS, DCF, Law Enforcement, Connecticut's Coalition to End Homelessness, Office of Victims Assistance, and many more. There have been a few others who have ran from the fire and chose to be a critic even, but none of you have. Each and every one of you and each and every one of the leaders of these organizations and their teams have not only been there for us, working hard on our challenges that we're experiencing, but are also performing courageously on behalf of their employees and our citizens. And lastly, any chance I get, I want to always make sure that I recognize all of our selfless and courageous correctional officers and health services staff been working tirelessly on the front lines of this pandemic and ensuring that we are providing the very best care possible considering the challenging circumstances. These folks and their families are often the forgotten heroes, and yet they're showing up for every shift, determined to see us all through this life-changing event. I just want you all to know I'm extremely proud of every single one of them. I'm proud to be serving with each of you. And that's my report. Open for questions.
This is Mark, and thank you, sir, and powerful note to end on, and it's something that can never be repeated enough of recognizing and appreciating the frontline professionals that had done this work every day before and during the emergency response. I'm going to go a bit out of order in a little bit. I wanted to just give people a heads up. I was going to ask Chairman Giles to go next, followed by Attorney Rapillo and Attorney Rosado. Then I'd like to ask Karen and Beth, if you're okay, I'd like to ask you to go after Attorney Rosado. I just want to be sure that you get a bit more time to give your update. Sorry for going out of order. But Mr. Chairman, would you care to go next with some updates?
Thank you so much. I owe a great debt of gratitude to our team over here who have constantly updated the website and pivoted very successfully to an online model for the public to access our continued parole hearings. We have continued to grant expedited pardon hearings, but because of the generous partnership we have with the court, we're not able to have the full hearing pardon hearings, but the majority of our hearings, pardon hearings, are granted through the expedited process. So we continue to do that. We have partnered, of course, with corrections on a plan for the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have done a lot of work with the transfer parole mechanism under the chair's authority here to grant some nearly 100 releases in keeping with public safety and victim input. Those persons have already been heard and were awaiting release, but had already been affirmatively granted parole, so we just moved those dates up. So we continue to do our work and are thankful for all the partnership that we share with everybody around the on the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Chris, Attorney Rapillo, would you mind going next, please?
Sure. So, I mean, I think like a lot of people, as this was unraveling, we as a group had to make a decision about what role were we going to play and what would we do that would be the most beneficial to our clients and really result in the most people being able to be safely released home. And you know, since immediately there was an effort to collaborate, we decided, and I think rightfully decided, that that would be the way to go. So we continue to work with the prosecutors, with the judicial branch to review files. Our current focus is to continuing to have bond reductions heard, but also to be looking at files to make sure that people who have been held pretrial, who may have had their cases continued a few times, who haven't been able to be released with a bond reduction, are not going to max out on their time while they're sitting pretrial. So those cases have been prioritized. They're being discussed with the prosecutors. They're getting in front of judges. And we're doing everything we can to make sure those cases get resolved quickly. And luckily, with our focus on the low bonds early on, there aren't too many of them. And we appear to be being pretty efficient at catching everybody. again, the list that we've received from the Department of Corrections and mostly from CSSD have helped us identify clients. We've also had some input from some community groups. The Connecticut Bail Fund provided us with a list of folks who had community supporters. So we provided that both to our attorneys, to our assigned counsel, and we reached out to the Department of Corrections Parole and Community Service Unit to let them know that we have that as a resource and social workers that would be willing to assist them if they were looking to try to get some help in finding community placements for folks who have been our clients who are currently sentenced to the DOC. We're trying to work on plans to reopen. I think Attorney Colangelo's idea to start discussing pretrial cases will help. There's going to be a significant backlog when we can finally open. We're starting to talk about, how do we do that safely? How do we keep our staff safe? How do we provide respectful communication with our clients? Client communication has been a challenge for us with courts being closed and messages difficult to forward. Making sure that our folks are able to get in touch with us has been an ongoing process. Again, the DOC was great. They let us know that there were inmates in particular facilities that were really struggling with reaching their public defenders, and they were willing to post contact lists with all the counselors for us, with the backup being that folks call here and often get John Day or I to answer the phone. But that really has, I think, improved our ability, the ability for people to reach us. And just on a final note, I'm hoping that kind of as we move forward from this, I mean, we've really sort of changed a lot of our behavior. More people are being released, fewer people being arrested, and that we can study the impact on this. We've spent a lot of time over the last years talking about bail reform and criminal justice reform, and I think it'll be important to see what the impact of all of these changes had long term. What was the failure to appear rate? Did we see an increase or a decrease in crime? Were we able to release a lot of people and sort of see all the data stay the same or maybe get better? And I think that will, as we start to come out of this in the current months, I hope that becomes a talking point for this group. So thank you.
Point very well taken and challenge accepted. I think you've nailed it as always, Attorney Rapillo. I think that's the I think your perspective on once we get past this, I think is and changes begin to occur. How do we document, track, and draw on what's worked and double down on it and preserve it, sustain it, and how do we learn from the situation? Very well stated. Attorney Rosado, would you care to go next from DCJ?
Sure. And I just wanted to take a few minutes to focus on what I think I was a little nervous in the beginning about how this would all work as we all begin working from home, teleworking. But I've been amazed at the amount of productivity that I've been seeing across the board from all of the criminal justice agencies, the judicial branch. I would just like to point out a couple of things here at the division that we've been working on since everyone has been home. Been spending a lot of time learning about video conferencing technology in relation to our oral arguments with the Supreme Court and the Appellate Court. We're setting up facilities for our prosecutors to use to be able to do that, and it may be something that continues into the fall, so it's kind of a big deal. As well as using Microsoft Teams technology to allow the attorneys to participate in the mooting of their briefs before they get to the point where they actually present those arguments to the courts. Sticking with the technology theme, on our case management system project, we have continued to work both in limited capacity here at the office in Rocky Hill, but mostly remotely from different locations around the state with all of our partners, to include the CIS team led by Director Begg, working with our partners at Judicial in terms of getting information and data from them to be able to complete our user acceptance testing and our pre-production rollout. It's been, I think, a lot of progress has been made over the last, I'll say, 8 weeks in terms of actually getting data into our system, doing quality assurance with our vendor, and then having our end users start to really thoroughly test the system. And since, I'd like to point out for the community, since the division, to my knowledge, is the first agency to be getting data and information from CIS, we are sort of hip deep in the proof of concept for the idea of CIS working and feeding all of our systems. We are working very hard with our partners to make sure that that data is good data. We're scheduled on June 12th to get 1 year's worth of data from the judicial branch, and then if that goes well, on June 26th, we'll get 10 years worth of data. And essentially, at that point in time, we'll consider our system to be up and running and functional. And then the next phase, which will be I think a challenging phase, will be the rollout to all of the locations around the division and all that encompasses. Of course, we'll be starting at GA9 and using that as our test site. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, sir. Appreciate the update. And I think I'll turn next first to Karen and then to Beth from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Alliance to End Sexual Violence. Karen, could you mind going next?
Sure, thank you. This has been really helpful to hear from everyone around their various systems and how they're adjusting. What I would say is that the domestic violence advocacy system has been equally remarkable. I'm just so grateful and impressed by the work that's happening within the 18 designated domestic violence organization sites in terms of how they're offering intense and ongoing advocacy to victims and survivors during this uncertain time. 99% of the advocacy that's occurring on the ground right now is remote. Those are advocates who are talking with victims and survivors either by phone or by text or email or virtually, having a conversation. There are some advocates that are still going obviously into shelters and working with those families in shelters, and I'll speak to that in one moment. And then there are also some advocates who are continuing, legal advocates, to attend arraignments in court and to assist victims through that process where there's been an arrest. Shelters, when we started this pandemic around early to mid-March, were at 130% capacity, which is quite normal for our system where families and individuals are paired up in rooms or general areas to accommodate the need for safety. Given the social distancing guidance and requirements, we had to really work very, very quickly to make a change. And so the Department of Housing in particular has been truly amazing in terms of how they adjusted their many of their policies around how we're utilizing, in particular, the domestic violence rapid rehousing dollars that we manage within our system. And so since the beginning of March, since March 1st, 40 families have been housed through that project. So we've been quickly moving families into permanent spaces so that they can be assisted during this time and to be safe and to be in a stable housing environment. So shelters are now at 96% capacity. What that means is that no family or individual is sharing a room, but technically we're at 118% capacity statewide because we are utilizing some philanthropic dollars that I reached out to receive and some dollars that CCADV identified to quickly put families in hotels near the organization where they're being helped. So it was really important that we hotel families near the domestic violence organization so that advocate could be working with that family and helping them intensely. What I mentioned earlier around the decline in calls for service by law enforcement statewide of 4%, but yet an 8% increase in lethality assessment work that's happening with victims and survivors at the scene of a family violence incident. I just want to really acknowledge and thank the judicial branch and the governor's office in terms of the work that occurred to allow for online restraining order applications. So victims and survivors can apply for a restraining order online, which I believe, and Judge Carroll is the better person to speak to this, but I think that's unprecedented. We are, through our CT Safe Connect project, putting out there that we can assist with that process. And we've had nearly 30 individuals who have utilized the ctsafeconnect.org to process with an advocate their online restraining order application. And then the advocates within the various sites are actively working with marshals to have the order served and then working to support the victim at the permanent hearing, which happens in person at this point. And so we are also, though, collecting arraignment data, and we're needing to do this anecdotally, but legal advocates are collecting data to understand what's happening at domestic violence IPV arraignments, to understand the outcome of those circumstances. We know that domestic violence offender programs are temporarily suspended. There have been anecdotally the feedback we're getting from advocates, concerns around the way that police reports are identifying the charges and listing things as maybe a disorderly or breach of peace when there were much more serious assaults happening and or strangulation. And then trying to understand what happens therefore at the arraignment when we know that cases are being continued into the summer. Offender programs are understandably suspended, but then what are those outcomes? What are the conditions of those release? And then what are the orders being put in place? So that's what's happening in the system around domestic violence.
Karen, thank you very much for that thoughtful and detailed update, and for the contributions that the LAP program made to enabling us to look at some data today. Beth, would you care to go next?
Sure, and I definitely want to start by thanking you, Mark, for your warm welcome and introduction this morning. It's my absolute pleasure to be working with you and to be joining the commission. On the sexual assault side, our services remain fully operational, albeit remote, as with most other folks' services. And we continue to work with victims and survivors across the state who are reporting that generally social distancing and isolation has increased trauma, triggered a lot of folks, and is just generally difficult. Our sexual assault crisis service centers have done an outstanding job to pivot services online, are now fully providing counseling, advocacy, support groups, accompaniments, and all services essentially remotely. Similar to what CCADV just reported, there are very limited instances in which we are doing in-person accompaniments or in-person advocacy and counseling, and most of our work also has moved to online. We continue to work with both state agencies and community partners to ensure that victims and survivors are able to link up with services and support in the ways that are most comfortable for them. And, I really also want to applaud the work of our advocates statewide who have, without a lot of lead time, really sort of stepped up and done an amazing job of making sure that services are accessible, that they are proactively reaching out to the clients that they work with, and then are able to reach out to new folks who might need support during these difficult times. Like CCADV, also, we've seen a bit of a decrease in the number of people seeking support for the first time, but we actually have seen a significant increase in the number of victims and survivors who have previously worked with our centers who are now reaching out for some additional support. And our support groups in particular are more full than they ever have been, which is really interesting for us because they're virtual. And we really thought that there'd be real limitations with privacy. And, myself, having 2 children at home, I imagine it'd be harder for folks to find that kind of time to be on support groups or find the privacy. And they're actually running very, very well and at high capacity. I also want to say that in terms of impacts on victims, we really want to applaud everyone on this call who've done an excellent job of working to continue to keep systems moving, which we really could not applaud you enough because it's quite an undertaking during these unprecedented times. But we also know that, the things that we've heard from survivors and victims is that it's causing some challenges. As I mentioned earlier, there's been some challenges with supporting victims during forensic evidence collection. At this point, most hospital emergency departments are not allowing our advocates to come in. We are doing that work remotely, so via telephone with survivors, but there have been additional fears and barriers that have really impacted whether or not folks are actually going, both to report to police, but then also getting evidence collection done following a sexual assault. We also know, in working with our law enforcement community partners, that challenges remain in terms of reporting to police, moving through investigations, securing arrest warrants, and some other things like that have really impacted the way that law enforcement is able to support victims, although they're doing a great job under the circumstances. And we also know that court operations hours have been reduced. There's been some closings and case continuances. Those things have also felt like they've negatively impacted the victims and survivors that we're working with. Our post-conviction victim service advocate team, this is the collaborative partnership between parole, probation, our advocates, and sex offender treatment. We have seen an increase of victims and survivors reaching out with anxiety and fears about the offenders who are being supervised and possibly receiving limited offender treatment right now. And we've continued to work closely with our collaborative partners on the sex offender supervision units to alleviate those fears, make sure that folks have really good follow-up and some consistency. And so I really applaud all those collaborative partners who are also doing that work. And then finally, our team of attorneys, we have Victim Rights Center of Connecticut is 5 attorneys who are dedicated to supporting victims of sexual violence on the criminal side, have had very positive experiences. We've had 3 attorneys at this point who have needed to go into court to represent clients over this past month, and we want to extend our gratitude to all of you who are supporting those operations because those have gone really seamlessly and we've had good outcomes. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Okay, a reminder of why we're grateful to have your presence. Yes, Karen?
Mark, I just forgot, I meant to add in one more thing, and I apologize. I just want to acknowledge Joe DeTuno and his team at Family Services. They've really been actively working with our project leads around legal advocacy, keeping us informed of changes within the process that courts are using to manage domestic violence arrests and arraignments. And so I just want to acknowledge just how helpful that ongoing communication has been.
Thank you, Karen. Really helpful reminder and great to have updates from you and Beth, and look forward to further work together on the commission. I'm going to ask Dr. Norco to go next, followed by Director Begg. Dr. Norco, you ready to provide some updates, if you could?
Yes, sure. Let me start with the DEMAS report. So DEMAS has identified spaces at all of the state-operated facilities for isolation of patients with COVID-19. PPEs and sanitizer have been distributed to all of the state-operated facilities. We've developed quarantine and isolation protocols for patients and staff, and those have been reviewed and approved by the Department of Public Health. We've changed the way that outpatient services are delivered. Group processes were shut down. Some things like wellness centers and social clubs were closed, but we've managed to do more telephone check-ins with clients to make sure that people are doing well and receiving the support that they need. Visitors have been restricted from DEMAS facilities. Anyone entering a DEMAS facility has to go through a health screen that includes a series of questions and taking their temperature. Over 1,100 employees of DEMAS have been approved for telework in order to promote social distancing, and directions have been given for staff about how to deal with if they have symptoms or suspected symptoms. There have been at Connecticut Valley Hospital 34 patients with confirmed COVID and 22 staff. At Whiting, 10 patients and 17 staff. And there have been a few other staff at various of the other facilities, but no patients yet at the other facilities. And to date, 9 patients at CVH and 7 patients at Whiting have recovered, and 21 staff members have recovered and provided medical documentation that they're safe to return to work. DEMAS also was awarded a $2 million SAMHSA grant for pandemic-related behavioral health care needs for specific populations. And as part of that, some of these funds are going to help the Department of Corrections with telehealth. I believe those are mostly being used at Manson to facilitate contact with family members. There's a new statewide call center for behavioral health emergencies that's been expanded. The family-based recovery services for families with infants and toddlers who are at risk of abuse or neglect is being expanded in DCF through these monies. We've increased services for victims of intimate partner violence and also increased support for behavioral health needs of healthcare responders. In the Division of Forensic Services, and at the moment we're also applying for additional CARES Act funding through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and also preparing requests under an additional fund called the Coronavirus Emergency Supplemental Fund, which is being managed through OPM. At the moment, we're also working on new policies for telemedicine and teleconferencing. In forensic services, we've been looking to expand our video conferencing capacity and particularly our housing supports for people who are being diverted and for people on reentry. We've accomplished video conferencing testimony of cases of people who were in Whiting for restoration of competency. So far, 13 patients have been released from Whiting who either were found competent and the hearing was waived, or for whom a specific video conference was held because the person was not competent, not restorable, and could be moved to another safe and appropriate location. We've been doing probate court hearings by video conferencing at Whiting and at CVH for the last couple of weeks, and with a few hiccups, that's been going well and continuing to improve. We're hoping to be able to do PSRB hearings by the end of May. So that'll be able to get us back to doing that work. One other thing that happened before all of the shutdowns that's worth reporting on is in late February, we sponsored a grand rounds at CVH on individuals with autism who are in the criminal justice system, and we invited staff from DDS and DSS and DCF to attend the conference, and then it was an opportunity for about 20 or so of us afterward from the various agencies to have a meeting to talk about it. And at the Grand Rounds, we had people from the UK who have a very specific program and actually a facility that's designated to provide services for people with autism who are in the criminal justice system. And so it was a very useful discussion, and everybody was interested in trying to continue to meet and to think about developing some joint programs. And then, of course, we were all ordered to work from home, and we haven't been able to set up a second hearing yet, but we're hoping that we'll be able to do that as well. That grand rounds and the discussion about autism and people in the criminal justice system was a large part of the discussion at the Behavioral Health Subcommittee on March 5th, and we hope to continue that discussion. The next subcommittee meeting will be on June 4th. So I think that's my report.
Terrific, sir. Thank you very much for the update, and your reference to the grand rounds is a reminder of all the items that we are all looking forward to re-engaging in after there is a opening up of action. So thank you for reminding us of that and for your detailed update. Who are you to you next, and then I'll ask Vinny Russo if he's still on the phone to provide some DCF updates.
Sure, thank you. So very quick update, CJS, like everybody else, we are teleworking, and we are very successfully teleworking. We're already equipped to do some sort of work remotely because we travel a lot. We provided a full update, and if people are interested, there is a video on our website. We have provided a governing board update, which we usually do quarterly meeting for all the governing board members, but this quarter, we due to the pandemic, we did the video update for everybody with the question and answer via email. The video is available on our website if you're interested, and we are continuing to collaborate with our stakeholders and partners. As Attorney Rosoro mentioned, we are having regular meetings and making more progress. There has been no real slowdown as far as the COVID pandemic is concerned. We haven't had any impact from that perspective. Working remotely, having video conferencing and teleconferencing, and continuing to do our development work and deployment. On the training side, we've moved all our training to online, and in some ways that's been helpful. We've got more people trained than normally we do because everybody else is cloistered in their environment and is more willing to attend training sessions. And one other thing, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the two co-chairs, Judge Carroll and Deputy Secretary Diamantis, for helping us through the bond commission. The bond committee approved funding for our next phase, and we are moving forward to deployment and completing the data exchanges between different agencies, including state police, local municipal polices, as well as the criminal justice agencies. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Our pleasure, and thank you for the update. It's a reminder of ways technology are helping many of us to maintain essential operations and move and forward progress during these difficult times. Vinny, I'm really eager to just to recognize DCF's efforts. The DCF webpage has been tremendous at listing at resources, the coverage that received on other commissions or in the media about DCF's efforts have helped me to appreciate ways this agency has adapted to social distancing and to still serve clients around our state. You probably have a million things to share, hard to compress, but I wanted to at least express to you my appreciation for your department's efforts and eager to hear any updates you'd like to share at this time.
Well, thank you, Mark, very much for that. And yeah, there has been a ton of stuff. Obviously, we continue to operate as we have in the past, and except obviously under these extreme circumstances. So, we're at a point now where we have about 85% of our staff teleworking. Those 15% that aren't able to are the ones that are serving in our facilities at both Solnit North and Solnit South, our psychiatric residential treatment centers for our children. They continue to work 24/7, managing the education of those kids, the treatment of those kids, and ensuring that they have comfort during this time. Our care line continues to be fully functional, also 24/7, where we have staff doing it in shifts to allow for social distancing, but still being able to accept calls and reports of any abuse or neglect concerns. And of course, we have our investigators that continue to be on the ground, visiting homes when it's unable to assess the needs of children and their safety through other means. We have really, we've been focusing a lot on technology. We've deployed over 1,800 tablets to our staff across the state, so that way they can communicate via video conferencing, teleconference, update the narratives of their cases in real time, so we can all stay connected and on top of these cases, so we can ensure that the children are being properly cared for. So there, one thing I'd like to point out to the crew is just last week we launched a new warm line that we're calling "When It Builds Up, Talk It Out." In talking with families, we check in with our families regularly, at least once a week, with all of our open caseloads. And as we talk with them, we find that there are stressors that we're all feeling, but these families have particular needs that we're trying to help them address. And a lot of it is just the stress of being isolated and at home. And so what this Talk It Out line is meant to do is give parents and guardians a line and an ear, a friendly ear, to just kind of vent, express their frustration. And this line is really there to be supportive. It's there to listen. We have clinicians from our emergency services, our mobile emergency services units, answering the calls to help the parents and guardians through this time, give them some hope. And so far, we've, in just this past week, we've seen a lot of interest in it, and we're really trying to promote that line. So if there's more information on our website, obviously, if anybody wants to check it out. Specifically, when it comes to some of the juvenile justice issues, Linda Dixon, who heads up our adolescents unit and also works with our facilities, I know has worked closely with CSSD to transition some of the youth out of some of the detention centers into other living arrangements. I think at this point we've had about 11 kids in DCF care transfer out of detention facilities into some other arrangement. She's been working very hard on that. Our legal staff continues to work with judicial on through the juvenile court, specifically on getting cases that are priority 1 cases heard. And so I think with that, I'll just wrap up. There's a bunch of information. We're doing daily updates via email to policymakers. We're talking with policymakers constantly. And if you want any information, please feel free to visit our website or give me a call if you need to. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinny. Helpful to hear about the When It Builds It Up, Talk It Out, CT.com, and a phone line is available there for parents and caregivers who need someone to listen to, understand, and talk feelings out. Very, very helpful, great webpage. Thanks for mentioning it along with your other work. I'm going to turn to Ms. Siegel from Veterans and then to Gary LaBerge from CSSD. Ms. Siegel, any updates you wish to share?
Hi. Yes, the DVA is responding to COVID-19 with enhanced health and safety protocols to mitigate the risk. We've done things such as restricting visitors from campus, limiting travel. Everyone is screened for signs and symptoms. We do have our protocols posted on our website, and they are updated regularly as we review the situation and respond accordingly. Our commissioner also does post daily updates of how our veteran patients and residents are doing. We have a residential facility as well as a healthcare facility. As of yesterday, we have 4 positives in our healthcare center. We had 2 positives in our residential facility, and 1 was transferred out to a community-based hospital. We did set up isolation units in both the residential and the healthcare center in order to respond to the situation. Anybody who needs more acute care would be transferred out to a community-based facility. So that's where we stand right now. And it is on our website if anyone is interested. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for the update from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and great to know the website reference and for your update. Thank you very much. I think so after Gary, it leaves Dr. Cho and Eleanor Michael, and then we'll close out. I do want to acknowledge, I'm sorry we're running over time. I think one of the risks of delivering a presentation in isolation is you can get lost in your own thoughts. So in hindsight, I would have maybe sped it up a bit at times, but I was really feeling a responsibility to do justice to those slides and the data. I know your time is all very precious here, so I appreciate you all staying on a little bit longer. I'll do better next time. So Gary, to you, please, and then to Richard and Eleanor, please.
Yeah, sure, Mark. But, I am going to ask my boss, the Chief Court Administrator, Judge Carroll, if he'd like to leave the branch off, and then I'll have a few remarks after that.
Unfortunately, a judge wrote to me to share he did have to jump off to a unified command call, which is when I realized my poor time management had played out. The judge said he respectfully had to depart. He's sorry to have to leave, but he has to jump on that call. Yes, so he entrusted you, Gary.
Oh, boy. All right, so I'll give a couple more updates from what I was talking about earlier when we were talking about the pretrial population. We continue to work on many different things, and I just want to acknowledge Rob Cristiano, one of our pretrial bail managers, Mike Hines, our deputy director of bail, and the work that they've been doing with Commissioner Cook's staff to set up video conferencing so that we can have people released directly from DOC. We're starting to ramp up referrals, and thank you, Commissioner Delphin Rittman over in VMIS, because, in our collaborative with VMIS and our residential treatment programs, we have people that are held pretrial waiting to get into a program, and we had to cut back on referrals to make certain that we had social distancing within our programs, but we're starting to be able to make additional referrals or start to resume referrals to those programs, which is going to be another plus for the pretrial population. Our night staff continues to go in. We have a night staff in bail that works throughout the week from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. They do a great job of looking at cases that the police hold on bond, and we've been able to release many individuals prior to arraignment. I think that's helping the pretrial numbers as well. And in addition, we set up a process where at night, again, getting back to Regional Manager Cristiano, if there's a bond that comes in on a nonviolent FT, like a failure to appear, violation of probation with a court set bond, Judge Alexander has made herself available to Rob, and he can give her a call. They discuss the case, and she will override the judge's order on that as the chief judge of criminal. And we've been able to release a number of individuals through that process, which has been helpful to us as well. The jail re-interview program continues to go in and do their work with the Department of Correction. Thank you, Commissioner Cook, for helping us do that. We're obviously doing that by way of video conferencing and phone calls, but we continue to do bond screens. And as I said, we're going to ramp up doing referrals to our residential treatment programs. And I just want to talk about our residential providers for too. They continue to operate transitional houses and our community congregate care programs like Vinny was just talking about before, all the work that his programs are doing. And Vinny, DCF, you and DCF and your colleagues and Linda, who have been very collaborative in helping us get kids out of our detention centers. I truly appreciate that, and that's been a really good working relationship. As everybody knows, we're down to 6 adult court locations, and our domestic violence folks are coming in every day. Karen, thank you for acknowledging Joe DeTuno and the work that he's doing with his family staff throughout the state and their collaboration with you and your CCADV advocates. And the adult probation offices have all remained open other than the 2 court locations that we had to close in Torrington and Stamford. Those staff are working out of Norwalk, Bristol, or New Britain. So our adult probation officers have been operational and offices have been operational through this entire process as well. And, Beth, we're working with your victim advocates on our sex offender cases and providing services to our clients. We obviously have identified our high-risk clients that we want to make sure that we stay in contact with and provide services for. The same on the juvenile probation side. And our alternative in the community program and adult behavioral health programs have remained operational. Although scaled back services, they continue to provide, basic needs management for our clients, teletherapy, and other teleservices over the phone and checking in just to make sure that our clients have what they need, and if they're not in a good place, how we can help them out to get to a better place. I'm going to wrap it up right now, but I have to say, and I want to I want to acknowledge Commissioner Cook, the work that his staff are doing in the correctional facilities, because as you know, the branch runs 2 detention centers, and our juvenile detention officers and staff that go in and have to run a 24/7 facility. People who don't work in that world don't understand what that means. And their courageousness, their professionalism, their dedication to the job and to the branch, have to be acknowledged. They are doing a tremendous job. I talked about my night staff. They're going in every night in the police departments, interviewing people, right? And they have not stopped doing their work in very complicated and unusual times. And the people that go into court every day, whether it's, the bail commissioners, the family counselors, the court clerks, the public defenders, the state's attorneys, interpreters, I'm missing people, but everybody that goes in and keeps the work going, you have to acknowledge, because we're all talking about how we're learning to work from home, right? These people aren't working from home. They're going in every day and doing the job in very tough and frightening circumstances. And I don't know if everybody knows, but we had an adult probation officer who passed away from COVID complications, a guy named Jonathan Coelho, 32 years old, 10-month-old baby, and a 2.5-year-old child as well, and he leaves behind a wife, Katie. Tragic story, but that's what we're dealing with. So the people that continue to go in and do this public-facing work and get the job done, my hat's off to them, because, like I said, truly complicated and unusual circumstances and an environment we're in. I appreciate everybody's collaboration and cooperation on this call. You all have been great partners in this, and we're going to get through it, but these are tough times. So I'll wrap up my remarks with that.
Director, thank you for that update, and I was emotionally moved by what you shared, especially toward the end. And when I learned of Mr. Coelho's passing, I observed an outpouring of grief from people I hold in the very highest esteem around this state, who had worked with the gentleman back into the early years of his career. And I could sense the heartbreak in the voices of the people who mentioned him and in the ways that he was described, and the outpouring of grief and sadness at his funeral. And I am so grateful that you took the time to acknowledge him as well, and his family, and to bring him into our discussion today to recognize his service and honor him. And I think you nailed it, sir, by citing courage, professionalism, and determination among those who are doing this work every day in the front lines, going into detention centers, jails, prisons, courthouses, homes, providing services to people in the system, people affected by the system, to victims. It's there is no way. Those will be many of the people that we will be reflecting on for years to come when we look back on this. Those who did the work and found ways to adapt and to deliver the services needed to keep systems operating. I'm very grateful, Gary, that you shared that. Thank you, sir. Dr. Cho and then Eleanor for updates, please.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and want to just echo Gary's sentiments about the incredible work that Department of Correction has been doing. And just one piece that I want to highlight and not take up too much time is just the fact that when the COVID pandemic hit, that the Department of Corrections reached out to us to say that they were concerned about the folks who were being released at end of sentence, who, given the fact that we were also working to try to decompress shelters into hotels at the same time and reduce new shelter admissions to not otherwise flood congregate shelters with more people at a time when that was unadvisable for the pandemic, that DOC called and said they were concerned about the number of folks who would otherwise be released to the street at end of sentence. And again, the fact that DOC was concerned about a population of people who are no longer even under custody, but was concerned about what happens to them afterwards, I think just shows the compassion and dedication that they have for the population. So really kudos to Commissioner Cook and your team for that. But I want to share a little bit more details about the DOC Reentry Housing Assistance Program, or DRAP as we're now calling it, which was really put together in the last 2 weeks in partnership with OPM and DOC. And just thank you to you, Mark, and Eleanor, and Commissioner Cook and his team for the partnership in this. Basically, what this program does is identifies individuals who are slated for discharge 60 days prior to hitting their end of sentence. And we've worked out a program flow in which DOC staff and also CSSD staff work on trying to identify housing solutions for persons and exhaust all other alternatives. And when they're not able to do that, they would then refer to one of the regional lead agencies. So we, over the last 2 weeks, have recruited regional agencies who are nonprofits in the community and who provide housing search, navigation, and rental assistance to persons to work across the state. And at a time when nonprofits were dealing with a number of challenges, it was not easy to convince them to also take this on. So I want to really credit all of our partners in the community who are working on this. But any individuals who cannot find other safe and stable housing alternatives would get referred to one of these lead agencies, and those agencies would begin working with that client 30 days pre-release to try to create a housing plan. We also have made some modifications to the 211 and CAN policies, so that now, whereas previously an inmate could not call 211 until 48 hours prior to the discharge in most CAN regions, we've now relaxed that to be able to call 211 up to 30 days. So that is the process that we've identified and developed. In addition, the funds that were provided through OPM through the Justice Assistance Grants, roughly a little over $140,000, are being used to fund a number of flexible uses that can be paired with clients who are being assisted. They can help pay for security deposits, short-term rent subsidies, rental application fees, in some cases cost with hotels or motels if we need to find some interim housing. It can also be used to provide cell phones and smartphones so that people can actually receive telehealth and access to case management services, utility deposits, transportation, and other flexible expenses. I'll just share very quickly that in the last 30 days, and again, the funding that was provided was really to help us address this housing gap of people hitting their end of sentence within the next 30 days. We've received 61 referrals. Of those 61 referrals, we now have 17 individuals who are receiving rental assistance and have been housed. There's 11 currently in alternative housing, which is a hotel or motel or other situation that are in the queue to move into permanent housing. 10 individuals have been able to be placed with CSSD in some of the transitional housing that they contract with, and 4 of those individuals either refused assistance or were unable to be contacted, but the vast majority are now in some form of housing. And so we very quickly were able to create a successful model, and it's my hope that we can continue to expand upon this so we can serve folks who are going to be released beyond the next 30 days, but potentially as far as into the future as possible. So again, just thank you to everyone for the collaboration.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so grateful you joined and participated in the discussion. And I think about the improvements carried out to the CANS system, to housing assistance across our state prior to the pandemic that enabled the regions, the service providers, your coalition to partner and manage this incredibly challenging period with the decompression happening in the emergency shelters, the strains on community providers, the enormous changes happening hourly and daily in our state. And if you didn't have that framework, that policy, that process in place, I can't imagine how the coalition and providers would have managed that transition, let alone step forward and reach out to CSSD, DOC, other criminal justice agencies to help during this period when there will be people otherwise heading out into homelessness. And so I think, just as Attorney Rapillo mentioned, ways to learn from this experience into the future, I think this partnership, the various partnerships you've established also provide opportunities to extrapolate and build and grow. But what you accomplished would not have been possible had you not achieved those impacts in reducing homelessness in our state much prior. So it's a pleasure to partner with you. Thank you for the work of your coalition and the providers around our state and for the partnership. Eleanor, we work very closely together, and I feel very guilty running over today. And I know you had much to share in the update, and I know you are far better than I at practicing brevity. So I will put it in your good hands to provide your update, and I apologize for my poor time management today. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much, Mark. I just wanted to give a quick update on some new funding that we at OPM will be administering. Under the CARES Act, the federal government has sent funds to the states through a variety of new funding streams. One such new funding stream that flows from the Federal Bureau of Justice Assistance to the state administering agencies for the Federal Justice Assistance Grant is called CESF. Although this grant is coming to the administering agencies for JAG grants, it is not considered a JAG grant, but instead it has a fancy new name. It's being called the Coronavirus Emergency Supplemental Funding Grant, or CESF. These funds are to be utilized to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So as most of you know, our division at OPM, the Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Division, is the state administering agency for JAG grants, and therefore we are also responsible for administering this new funding stream. Connecticut at the state level is eligible to receive just shy of $6 million for this new grant. In addition, there are 16 municipalities that are eligible to receive the CESF grant directly from the federal government, and the total amount going to those municipalities is just shy of $3 million. In order to receive these new federal dollars, Connecticut and these eligible municipalities have to submit an application to BJA. Those applications are due by May 29th, but BJA is reviewing them on a rolling basis, really looking to expedite getting these funds to the states. I'm happy to report that we at OPM submitted our applications to the federal government just about 2 weeks ago, and we understand from conversations with other states that applications are being approved very quickly. So we are hopeful that we will receive good news from BJA shortly that our application has been accepted and we can begin to draw down those funds as soon as possible.
Thank you, Eleanor. Really appreciate the update and appreciate all the folks in your unit that are working to get applications submitted and to work with the federal government on these funds. Did I forget anyone or omit someone in the introduction with the chance to do updates? Great, that's good. Well, thank you very much. We will be posting an audio file of today's meeting on our website. We appreciate members of the public who follow the live event, and I appreciate the members who came together virtually to have our meeting today. I apologize for running long. It was hard for me to predict how long different sections would take, and I hope this was beneficial to everybody. and helps us feel greater connected. I think the updates all shared some level of adaptation, partnership, and hard work during this unprecedented period in our state. Our next CJPAC meeting is scheduled for Thursday, May 28th at 9 a.m. I'll regroup with our IT team, and I'm grateful for David Camille's incredible efforts to make this all possible. Without him, this never would have happened. And we'll put our heads together for lessons learned and ways to make this smoother for everybody next time around. But this concludes our meeting. I'm going to move to adjourn it and thank everyone for their precious time today. Be safe and be well, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.